Hello and welcome to The Point. I'm Marcel Wieder, coming to you from the Peach Gallery in downtown Toronto. Today, we'll take you from Queen's Park to the voting booth, to the hallowed halls of the Canadian News Hall of Fame. All that and more on this edition of The Point. We're in the final weeks of Ontario's municipal elections. Campaigns across the province are in full swing as candidates race to secure last-minute votes. John Tory, Doug Ford, and Olivia Chow continue to hold the top 3 spots in that order in the Toronto mayoralty race. In Ward 2, Rob Ford hopes to win back his old seat after stepping down from the mayoralty contest. In Ward 7, Giorgio Mamalides' near 20-year run is being challenged by newcomer Nick Denizio. And former mayoralty candidate Sarah Thompson and Trinity Spadina NDP candidate Joe Cressy are both locked in battle in Ward 20 after Adam Vaughan stepped down to run for Parliament successfully. Enzo DiMatteo is senior news editor with NOW Magazine. He's here with more on the municipal elections and what areas we should keep our eyes on in the GTA, and more specifically in Toronto, we'll talk about today. Enzo, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Marcel.
So let's start with the recent mayoralty polls. John Tory is in the lead with about 42%, followed by Doug Ford, Olivia Chow. Is it time now for a victory lap for John Tory, or is there a possibility of an upset?
I'm not so sure how much of a possibility there is of an upset. I mean, we've had some polls from forums suggesting that Doug Ford may be a little closer to John Tory than people think. I think there may be some questions around the methodology of that particular poll, which came out about a week and a half ago. There may be some skewing of different population, in particular the youth vote. But I don't think it's time for John Tory to be doing a victory lap just yet. I mean, we're seeing a couple of pretty, I wouldn't call them vicious, but pretty pointed attacks by the Chow campaign. And I'm not sure, I think people are starting to take note of some of the problems with his Smart Track plan. And I think people are starting to, a little bit of that resonance from his label of being a political loser, for lack of a better term, might be starting to creep into people's thinking a little bit, because there have been a couple of missteps at a number of all candidates meetings. I mean, he was on the weekend, for example, he was asked a question about white privilege and didn't quite answer it in the most deft way. I would wait for the next poll to see where we're at. I'm sort of anticipating a bit of an elastic effect where we're seeing Ford's support kind of grow a little bit, and then I think it'll just flex back, and I think we'll probably reach a new normal where basically we'll see Tory at around 40% and maybe Chow probably around 20 and Doug around 30. So I think that's what I'm anticipating as some kind of elastic effect. But one never knows with municipal politics. It's a bit of a crapshoot sometimes.
Exactly, especially with only 50% of the voters actually turning out. So in terms of the election, all eyes are being focused on the mayoralty campaign, but there's 44 ward races going on across the city. What are some of the races that you're watching?
Well, obviously, there's probably about a dozen or so members of council who've been there for a very long time and for whom there's a bit of blowback going on right now. There are some members of council who haven't acquitted themselves, sidling up too close to Rob Ford and now finding themselves in a bit of a no man's land when it comes to what they're telling people at the doors. Are you supporting Rob Ford or not? Or you supported Rob Ford on this or that particular issue? And I think they're probably feeling a little bit of a blowback. There's some pretty interesting, obviously there's the more high-profile races locally that there's a lot of ink being spent on. Of course, there's the Paula Fletcher versus Liz West. And Jane Farrow has registered to run there. She's a very popular sort of centrist lefty who's for a short time she was Mary Margaret McMahon's EA, who thinks that she can probably win a little bit of the centrist vote in that area, which is causing Paula Fletcher some concern, of course, because last time she only won by, I think it was 259
very,
votes
very close
against Liz West. Although I don't think Liz West will probably be as strong this time around. I think there are a few things that Paula Fletcher did late in the council term. The Red Door Shelter is the one thing that sort of comes to mind most obviously, which I think may have helped her, may have increased her standing a little bit among some of the local residents that might be considering switching. What effect Farrow might have on the vote is an interesting question. She might, in fact, split the anti-Fletcher vote. The Beaches is well, it's Toronto Danforth really, but it kind of streams down Riverdale. It's a bit of a mixed bag. You get a little bit of the sort of provincial flavor may resonate, where you get a little bit of a liberal conservative divide happening sometimes there. It's a little bit, I'm a little bit unsure how that will go at this point. There's still, a couple of weeks left, so there may be one or two things that happen within those intervening days that might tip it one way or another. But I think Paula Fletcher looks pretty strong still.
Another race that people are looking at is Ward 2 in Etobicoke, where Rob Ford dropped off the mayoralty ballot and is now seeking to get reelected in his old seat. How do you see that going?
Well, I mean, I doubt that Rob Ford is going to have any problem being reelected. I mean, obviously, there's the sympathy factor that goes into, of course, his cancer diagnosis and so forth. I'm just wondering how many people will view his health as an issue for them. There are a couple of really interesting candidates running there. Andre Domaez, of course, who's got a lot of media coverage, who I think is supporting John Tory, actually. And
he is.
Munir Abukar, a young woman who's represented, who's
Smalley.
done some work with Toronto Community Housing.
Yeah.
Who I think is a very interesting candidate, very well-spoken, very articulate, has been working very, very hard, represents the Somali contingent in that particular neighborhood. Although I'm not sure how much of the demographics, I think people kind of overstate the demographics in that area. I mean, I know a lot of people mention that there's the Somali community, there's a Punjabi community, there's a lot of other ethnic communities in that area that the Fords have been able to mine over time. But I think the divide there, and in many of the inner suburb races, is more along homeowners versus tenants. And in that particular riding, you have a huge number of homeowners who dominate. So, and actually English speaking is the number one, is the main group there. So how much of a dynamic the actual multicultural or ethnic makeup of the riding, although in municipal politics, a lot of people do vote along ethnic lines, will have in that particular race, I think it's slightly overstated. I think the last poll showed Rob Ford at about 65%. I'd be a little bit worried in terms of his own health. I mean, he's going to go under, I think, a second round of chemo, and he hasn't been able to campaign that much. He's been here and there. So depending on how he may look the next time he shows up on camera, I know it's very harsh to say, but politics being something of an aesthetic game. I think if he doesn't look too good, it might cause some people to reconsider their vote.
In the adjacent or nearby ward of, you've got Maria Aujameri versus Gus Cusumano. It was one of the most acrimonious campaigns of the 2010 election. And it was also, I think, the closest race in the city of Toronto, where it was less than 100 votes and a judicial recount. And they've had their feud continue since then. Any thoughts on that campaign?
I'm wondering how much Cusumano will be able to repeat what happened last time. He was running very much on the strength of the Ford campaign. And so How much that will resonate this time around, I'm not sure. At the time, there was also some concern around the Sunrise propane gas explosion, which caused a little bit of blowback for Ajimeri. This time around, I don't think that's part of the component there, or less of a component. There's been a recent legal settlement in that particular situation, so I don't think that's as much of an issue. I think Ajimeri has sort of done enough in the last year of this current term of council to raise her profile. I mean, I think she became chair of the TTC. She was pretty strong advocate on transit. You know, she took the famous bus ride along Finch. And the riding itself is very much very much one of those ridings that relies very heavily on I call it the nonno and nonna factor, which for those who are not Italian, that means grandfather and grandmother. But Ajimeri's sort of political survival has been pretty much being able to mine that particular vote. And I think that's pretty much a very strong base for her. I know that there was some worry last time that she might lose to Cusimano, which is why she brought some people over from other NDP related, from provincial NDP ranks who have a little bit more of a handle on how to present candidates.
Right.
Brought them into the fold to help her out. I think this time Cusimano is going to probably have a bit of more of a difficult time, maybe eating into her support. That's my guess.
Well, Enzo, we really appreciate you coming down today to talk about some of the races that we'll be watching on the 27th. I'm with NOW Magazine Senior News Editor, Enzo DiMatteo. Thank you for joining us. Up next on The Point, we head to Queen's Park, where the Ontario Legislature is back in session. Welcome back to The Point. I'm Marcel Wieder. Summer has finally come to a close at Queen's Park, and the legislature is back in session after adjourning on July 24th. Before the break, Premier Kathleen Wynne was able to pass her provincial budget 6 weeks after being reelected with a majority government. The over $130 billion budget was identical to the one that triggered the June 12th election. It passed with a vote of 56 to 37. After the vote, members called it a day and went back to their ridings for their summer break. We're joined by Craig Hughson from Aurora Strategy Group to lay out the road ahead for Premier Wynne. Craig, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Marcel.
What do you expect is on the Premier's agenda for the first day back?
Well, I think she laid out her vision with the mandate letters that came out recently, so that all her ministers have their marching orders. They know what they need to do. They're a little bit sidetracked with the Mars building loan. Infrastructure Ontario seemed to lend money to without a business case, and that the Conservatives have jumped all over that today. So we'll see that noise as probably the most exciting thing coming out of Queen's Park. This is the first opportunity that Kathleen Wynne has really had to march forward with her vision, her agenda. No worries of an election, no worries of a minority parliament. This is an exciting time, and I think the Premier is quite enthusiastic about marching forward to her own tune, not having to deal with any of the baggage from the previous leader.
So you mentioned in your answer about mandate letters. Now, traditionally, those have been confidential, and the Premier decided to release those. Tell me a little bit about what those mandate letters are and why they're important.
Well, typically, they are not shared with the public. The mandate letter is the marching orders that each minister, once they take the post that they've been given by the Premier, and have certain commitments that typically have been in an election campaign, in the mandate letter, instructions step by step, what each minister needs to accomplish. This year, for the first time that I can ever recall, the Premier has released them publicly. I'm not convinced that was a great idea. This will give the opposition critics a built-in report card at 6 months, 1 year, in the next lead up to the next election. They now have something to hold each minister to account on. And it'll be interesting to see how the opposition and the government use these mandate letters and the fact that they're public.
Were there any surprises in the mandate letters?
Not a ton of surprises, maybe a little bit in transportation where they spelled out the single fare across the GTA and the crosstown LRT.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that was a lot of stuff in the mandate letters that just rehashed what was in their recent campaign platform. The focus on fiscal restraint and climate change probably had more relevance in each letter than I expected to see, but no surprise given the Liberal Green agenda.
So since the June election, PC leader Tim Hudak announced that he was going to retire. And 5 candidates have thrown their hats into the ring to replace him, including Christine Elliott, Vic Fideli, Lisa MacLeod, Monty McNaughton, and federal MP Patrick Brown. What are your thoughts on the Ontario PC leadership campaign?
Well, it started right away after the election as Tim Hudak wasted no time in stepping down. As leader, Christine Elliott, I think, wasted less than a week in deciding that she was going to announce her candidacy for leader. She did that quickly and was the only candidate in the game for a good number of months, until the other 5 you mentioned have slowly joined the race. Interesting that Christine Elliott, I think, perceived as a front runner, so maybe getting out off the hop early was the wise choice. Time will tell. The race is a long one compared to some of the leaderships we've seen, and early thoughts on the PC leadership were that they were going to deal with this really quickly, and I think cooler heads prevailed. They decided that they're going to stretch this out until May. There's quite a price tag attached to running for leader, and that will help the provincial party raise some funds to help pay their campaign bills. So we have, obviously, Christine Elliott as the front runner. Lisa MacLeod is a lot more right-wing than Christine Elliott. She is probably in second right now, and I wouldn't bet against her. And the other one I think that we need to watch, Vic Fideli, the man from North Bay. Conservatives have a soft spot in their heart for a leader from North Bay. As we'll all recall, they did fairly well under their leader, Mike Harris, who hailed from Nipissing. So there might be some folks in the party that think that they need another leader from North Bay.
Do you see the party shifting more to the right? Like, they were pretty right with Hudak and his platform. Are they going to stay on that right track, or are they going to try and shift more to the center with someone like Christine Elliott?
Christine Elliott obviously would bring the party back into the center. She is probably the most progressive of the progressive conservative candidates. If they go with a Vic Fideli or a Lisa MacLeod, that would indicate to me that they are not that keen as a party on shifting too far to the left.
And what about Patrick Brown? He's the MP for Barrie, and he's leaving a majority Conservative caucus in Ottawa to run for Queen's Park.
Well, he has said he's not leaving the caucus in Ottawa unless he's victorious in the leadership. So he's only half pregnant on this. And I don't know that he's going to get a ton of support in this campaign. Making a name for himself here in Ontario, that might be his end goal here. If he was really serious about winning, I think he would have stepped down.
Now, not to be outdone, NDP leader Andrea Horwath is facing her own leadership review coming up this November. How do you see that going?
Well, there is no shortage of disgruntlement in the rank and file of New Democrats these days. They didn't enjoy or didn't appreciate Andrea's initial reaction after the election. She didn't own enough of the defeat, taking her party from the balance of power in the minority parliament into back to being rabble-rousers in the backbench, and losing 3 marquee seats here in Toronto and picking up those same 3 more outside of Toronto. But nevertheless, they no longer hold the balance of power. A lot of New Democrats upset with that. I don't think Andrea will survive this leadership review. Interesting.
Now, she did fire her chief of staff and campaign director, and she brought in Michael Balagas, who was working at the Ontario Nurses Association and was a former chief of staff to Premier Gary Dewar in Manitoba to bring some semblance and order in her office. Do you think that move is enough to satisfy the people who are upset with how things went?
I don't think that it is, actually. I've never worked with Balagas at all, but I do hear great things about Michael, and think if anybody's up to the job, it's certainly him. But it may be too little too late. The NDP often like to point out that when governments change their cabinet, have cabinet shuffles, it's like rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic. I've seen that line on a good number of NDP press releases. So I think there might be a lot of NDP rank and file members that certainly see this move as exactly the same thing. Spoke with a fairly high profile New Democrat just last week who told me that they didn't see this mea culpa tour that Andrea has been going on with as all that genuine and maybe a little bit too late.
Now, one of the things that the NDP is looking at is breaking its traditional ties to labor, much like the federal NDP has done in Ottawa. And so is there any tension between the labor unions, which in the last election, by and large, supported the Liberals, mainly as a way of protecting against the Hudak attacks on labor, whether those schisms will be more exposed and will see the union support dissipate for the NDP?
Well, the one union that has stuck by Andrea's side, Smokey Thomas and OPSU, have really, and CUPE, through thick and thin, we are New Democrats and we are with you. We have seen certainly labor support, I think, start to shift and be less married to the New Democrats, and I expect to see more of that. And we'll see what happens in the leadership review, and if we do indeed end up in an NDP leadership, that certainly will clearly be part of the conversation then.
One last question. A federal election is on the horizon, and there are potential candidates from all three parties eyeing at jumping out of Queen's Park and into Ottawa, including some candidates who ran in the last election but weren't successful. Do you see any of that happening, both for the current sitting members and for some of the previous candidates?
You'd have to be a bit of a gambler to make that jump right now. All three parties have a little, all three party members would have a little bit to risk. If you're a Conservative in Ontario, you look at the polls right now, Justin Trudeau is doing quite well in Ottawa. Maybe not the best time if I'm a Conservative to jump into federal politics. If I'm a Liberal in Ontario, well, we've got a majority government for the next 4 years. Is Justin Trudeau a sure thing? They've yet to really start campaigning. That might not be the safest bet there. And if you're a New Democrat in Ontario, Thomas Mulcair is certainly doing his best in Ottawa, but not nearly as charismatic as his predecessor as leader. Maybe not, again, the best time to decide to jump from Ontario to Ottawa. So that makes it a tough gamble for anybody. I have heard a few names, people thinking about making that jump, and I don't know that we'll see a ton of that this time.
Well, Craig, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be sure to have you back again to keep us up to date on the comings and goings at Queen's Park. I was joined by our guest, Craig Hughson from the Aurora Strategy Group. After the break, we celebrate some of Canada's finest in journalism. The Canadian News Hall of Fame has inducted 2 new members. CTV Ottawa Bureau Chief Craig Oliver and tour stars John Hondrek were both honored in a banquet on October 15th. Canadian News Hall of Fame Chair Ian Connerty is with us for more. Thanks for joining us, Ian.
Thanks, Marcel.
Tell us a little bit about the Canadian News Hall of Fame.
Well, the News Hall of Fame was founded in 1965, and since then we've inducted over 100 worthy Canadian journalists. We have a committee of well-known journalists, including some members of the Hall of Fame now, who are on our selection committee. And once a year, names are submitted to the Hall or to the Toronto Press and Media Club, which founded the Hall, and forwarded to the committee. They make a selection, and this year they've selected John Hondrick and Craig Oliver.
So Ian, tell me a little bit about the two honorees.
Well, Craig his name was actually put forward 2 years ago, and what happens with the Hall is the name remains in the system until a decision is made. So this year was his time to be nominated, and he's a close personal friend of Lloyd Robertson, who was nominated 2 years ago. And Craig I've been talking to him on the phone. He's quite an interesting character. He was talking about his canoe trips with Pierre Trudeau and the gang when he was up in Ottawa with Trudeau. And he's quite an interesting character. John, it's going to be the first time that a father and son go into the Hall of Fame. His father was put into the Hall of Fame in '68. And so I checked the records, and that's the only two father and son teams we have in the Canadian News Hall of Fame.
Now, for those who don't know, John Hondrick is the head of Torstar, which is the parent company for the Toronto Star.
Correct. And John's career, of course, has included journalistic posts within the Star, working his way up, even though his family, through Torstar, owns a big chunk of the stock.
Mm-hmm. And looking forward, do you see a day when possibly a social media commentator will be inducted into the Hall of Fame, somebody who's a blogger or who does a podcast?
Well, as you and I and most people know, the media has changed dramatically in the last few years. In fact, last year, you could count one newspaper a week that was folding in the United States. So people are moving away from newspapers, and therefore, yes, the future has got to be towards internet and social media, and at some point, we will no doubt put somebody in. It's just in the last few years, for example, that women have achieved enough notoriety, shall we say, in broadcasting and print to be nominated for the Hall of Fame. And so now we have some great women in the Hall as well, like June Caldwood and Trina McQueen, for example. And so you go back in the early years, it was male dominated. It was also newspaper dominated. Now we put in equally a broadcast and a newspaper person per year. I can see down the road where it has to change, but nothing right on the horizon.
Well, I'm sure we'll be watching this and more over the coming years and seeing how the Hall changes. Ian, thank you so much for stopping by and sharing with us about the Canadian News Hall of Fame on The Point.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with a closing thought and highlights from the next edition of The Point. On Monday, October 27th, voters will cast their ballots for candidates in municipalities across Ontario to elect mayors, councillors, and school trustees that will shape the communities they live in. Every 4 years, we take for granted what most people around the world can't do, and that is to choose the people we want to represent us. In Hong Kong, pro-democracy protests have gripped the nation since late September, while if you turn to Toronto, only 50% of all eligible voters turned out on election day. Democracy can be a messy business, as we've witnessed during this election cycle. But as Winston Churchill noted, democracy is the worst form of government except when all others have been tried. Municipal politics are where we feel the most impact on our daily lives. Municipalities are now major engines in our nation's economy. For example, the City of Toronto, if measured against other provinces, would rank about 6th, ahead of all the maritime provinces. Big cities or small towns are facing major challenges delivering the programs and services that residents want with declining revenue and pressure to keep taxes low. That's why it's important for you to vote. You get to decide what the direction you want your local government to take. Read the candidates' literature, visit their websites, or contact them directly and ask them a question. After all, it's your money they're going to be spending. And that's the point. That's it for this edition of The Point. Catch us on October 30th for a special Ontario election edition of The Point, where we'll look at the results from the municipal campaigns with the biggest victories and upsets across the province. I'm Marcel Wieder. Thank you for watching.